Here we go. Let me begin writing part 1 of the review script for Asterisk Monster. Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi Asterisk for Bongo Gaming. I'll write until I reach the platform limit and stop at a natural continuation point. Okay. Let me just say this up front, right here, right now, before we get into anything else. If someone had walked up to me 6 months ago and told me that one of the shows I would end up thinking about the most this year is a fantasy academy drama from Indonesia about a guy who contracts goddesses through a forbidden soul mark, I would have laughed. Not because the premise sounds bad, but because it sounds so hyper-specific, so steeped in a particular flavor of genre fantasy, that you would assume it is playing to a very narrow crowd and nobody else. And yet here I am, sitting in front of my camera, genuinely wrestling with how I feel about Asterisk Monster. Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi Asterisk, because this show does things I did not expect, drops the ball in places I did not anticipate, and occasionally hits a level of emotional sincerity that caught me completely off guard. Welcome back to Bongo Gaming, everyone. Or if this is your first time here, welcome. We do long-form drama breakdowns on this channel, deep dives into shows that deserve more than a surface-level reaction, and today we are going to talk about this one at length. I am going to be covering some mid-story developments and character turns, but I will leave the very final moves a bit vague, so if you have not finished the show yet, you can still watch this without having the ending completely handed to you. That said, there will be moderate spoilers ahead, so consider yourself warned. If you enjoy this kind of long-form drama content, feel free to subscribe to Bongo Gaming so you do not miss the next one. We have a lot more coming. Now, let us get into this show, because there is a lot to unpack. The title itself deserves a moment. Asterisk Monster? Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi Star. In English, that roughly translates to something like Asterisk Monster? I am bound to the goddess's star. And I think the title is doing more work than it might appear at first glance. That question mark after monster is not accidental. It is not just a cool stylistic choice. It is a question the show is genuinely asking, both about its protagonist and about the world he inhabits. Who gets to decide what a monster is? Is it the person who wields dangerous power, or the system that forced them to take it? That question, when the show is firing on all cylinders, gives the story a thematic backbone that elevates it above a lot of its genre peers. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us start at the beginning. The setup of the show is built around Asgard Academy, which is exactly what it sounds like if you are familiar with this corner of fantasy fiction. It is an institution that trains individuals in a world where divine power, spiritual energy, and supernatural contracts are real, tangible forces. Think of it as a place where the hierarchy is not based on wealth or social class but on raw spiritual potential. And in this world, our main character, Luke Vane, is at the very bottom. Now, the show does something interesting with Luke's introduction. A lot of stories in this vein would start with their underdog protagonist having some secret hidden strength or a dramatic awakening in the first 5 minutes. Asterisk Monster? Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi Asterisk does not do that. For the first stretch of episodes, Luke genuinely appears to be exactly what everyone says he is, weak. He cannot keep up with his peers. He fails assessments. He gets looked down upon by instructors and classmates alike. And the show lets you sit in that discomfort. It does not rush to rescue him from his low status. It makes you feel the weight of being the person who everyone has already decided is worthless. That patience in the early episodes is one of the things I genuinely admire about this show's approach. Because when Luke's life finally changes, when he comes into contact with the Forbidden Soul mark, it does not feel like a cheap power fantasy shortcut. It feels earned. Not because he trained harder or suffered more dramatically than anyone else, but because the show spent real time establishing just how trapped he was before the mark found him. And there is a subtle difference between those two things. The mark does not reward him for being a good person or for working hard. It chooses him almost arbitrarily, or perhaps out of desperation, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the premise compelling. The Forbidden Soul mark itself is the engine of the entire story, so it is worth talking about in some detail. In the world of the show, there are various forms of spiritual contracts. Most of them are sanctioned, regulated, and understood by the Academy's curriculum. They are the safe, proved way of forming bonds between humans and higher beings. The Forbidden Soul mark operates outside that system entirely. It allows Luke to form binding contracts with female supernatural beings, creatures who are powerful in their own right, and through those contracts, both parties gain something. Luke gains access to power he could never generate on his own. The beings he contracts with gain a human anchor, a point of connection to the mortal world that seems to give them something they are missing. That second part is crucial, and it is something I think a lot of viewers might miss if they are not paying close attention. The contracts are not one-sided. Luke is not just collecting powerful women like trophies. Each relationship is a genuine exchange, and the show, when it is at its best, treats these dynamics with real nuance. The women in his circle are not accessories. They have their own reasons for entering these bonds, their own histories, their own vulnerabilities. And some of the best material in the show comes from watching those individual stories intersect with Luke's journey. But I want to be honest with you here, because this is where the show also starts to reveal its seams. There is an inherent tension in this kind of premise. On one hand, you have a story that wants to explore genuine emotional connections, power dynamics, questions of autonomy and consent, and what it means to form bonds with beings who are fundamentally different from you. On the other hand, you have a genre framework that has very well-established tropes around male protagonists who accumulate female companions. And those tropes are not always compatible with the kind of emotional depth the show is clearly reaching for. There are moments where the writing navigates that tension beautifully, where you can feel the creators pushing against the conventions of the genre and trying to say something real. And then there are moments where the show leans back into comfortable, familiar patterns, where the camera lingers in ways that undercut the emotional seriousness, or where a scene that should be about vulnerability and trust devolves into a comedic beat that deflates the entire mood. This inconsistency is, I think, the defining challenge of the show. It is what separates a very good version of this story from a great one. And depending on which episodes you are watching, you might land on either side of that line. Let me talk about Luke as a character for a bit, because he is more interesting than the premise might suggest. On the surface, he fits the archetype of the overlooked underdog who gets a sudden power boost and starts climbing the ranks. That is a story we have seen 100 times. But what I appreciate about Luke is that the show does not let him off the hook easily. His acquisition of the Forbidden Soul mark does not solve his insecurities. It does not instantly make him confident or socially capable. There is a stretch in the middle of the series where Luke has access to real power but still struggles to assert himself, still second-guesses his decisions, and still carries the psychological weight of having been told he is inadequate for most of his life. That is a detail that feels very human to me. Power does not erase trauma. Having people around you who care about you does not automatically undo years of being told you are nothing. And the show's willingness to let Luke sit in that messy middle ground, where he is simultaneously gaining strength and still feeling small, gives his arc a texture that a lot of similar protagonists lack. There is a specific moment, and I will keep this somewhat vague to respect the spoiler level, where Luke is faced with a situation that his older self would have run from. He has the power now to handle it. The contract abilities are there, the support of his bonded companions is there, and everything is in place for a straightforward heroic moment. But he freezes. Not because he lacks the ability, but because the fear is still there. The internal voice that tells him he is not enough has not gone quiet just because he found a magic mark. And the way the show handles that scene, the way it lets the silence stretch just a bit longer than you expect, the way the camera stays on his face as he wrestles with something that has nothing to do with physical strength, that was the moment I realized this show was not going to be what I initially assumed it would be. Now, I do not want to oversell this. The show is not some relentlessly serious psychological drama. It has plenty of lighter moments, comedic interludes, and genre-standard beats that will feel familiar to anyone who watches a lot of Fantasy Academy content. The humor is hit or miss, honestly. Some of the comedic timing is genuinely sharp, particularly in the banter between Luke and certain members of his growing circle. There is one character in particular, and we will get to her in a moment, whose dry, cutting wit provides some of the show's best comedic relief. But there are also stretches where the humor relies too heavily on the same few setups, misunderstandings, awkward physical proximity, characters overreacting to mundane situations. If you have watched more than a handful of shows in this genre, you have seen these beats before, and the show does not always find a fresh angle on them. That said, even the weaker comedic moments are usually saved by the performances. And this is where I want to spend some real time, because the cast of this show is doing a lot of heavy lifting. I need to start with the actor playing Luke, because his performance is the linchpin of the entire series. What I find remarkable about his portrayal is the restraint. This is not a flashy, scenery-chewing performance. Luke is a quiet character for much of the show, and the actor communicates a huge amount through small physical choices, the way he holds his shoulders when he is in a crowd of stronger peers, the slight hesitation before he speaks in a group, the way his posture shifts as he gains confidence over the course of the series. It is the kind of performance that might not grab you in a trailer or a highlight clip, but when you are watching the full arc, episode by episode, you realize just how much thought and control went into it. The women in Luke's circle are a mixed bag in terms of development, but several of them are genuinely compelling. Without getting into too many specifics, because the reveal of who joins Luke's contracts and when is part of the show's unfolding pleasure, I will say that the first major companion he bonds with is probably the best written character in the entire series. She is fierce, but not in the shallow, one-note way that a lot of strong female characters end up being in genre fiction. She has a history that informs every choice she makes. She has a reason for entering the contract with Luke that is deeply personal, and it has nothing to do with romantic attraction, at least not initially. Watching her relationship with Luke evolve from reluctant alliance to something more complex and emotionally layered is one of the show's genuine strengths. There is another companion who enters the picture a bit later, and her dynamic with Luke is almost the inverse. Where the first companion challenges Luke to be stronger, this second one challenges him to be softer, to be honest about his fears, to admit when he needs help. And the contrast between those two relationships creates a push and pull in Luke's character development that keeps it from ever feeling static. He is not just getting stronger in one direction. He is being pulled between different models of what strength looks like, and he has to figure out which one is really him, or maybe figure out that it does not have to be either one. The performances of the actresses who play these roles are both excellent, though in very different ways. The first brings a kind of coiled intensity to every scene. There is a physicality to her performance that communicates threat even when she is standing still. You believe that this character could destroy people, and you also believe that she is choosing not to, and that the choice costs her something. The second actress brings a warmth and a softness that could easily have been written as weakness, but her performance insists on framing it as a different kind of strength. Her quietest scenes are often her most powerful. And that brings us to the world building, which is one of the show's more uneven aspects. Asgard Academy as a setting is both the show's greatest asset and one of its recurring frustrations. The concept is strong, a place where spiritual power determines social standing, where the institution itself is both a place of learning and a place of systemic control. There are moments when the show really digs into what that means, when it explores how the Academy's hierarchy reproduces itself, how the people at the top benefit from keeping others weak, and how even well-meaning instructors become complicit in a system they did not design but continue to uphold. Those moments are some of the show's most intellectually engaging material. But the execution is inconsistent. The Academy's rules and systems sometimes feel like they are being made up on the fly. There are moments where a specific power system or institutional rule is introduced, seems important for an episode or two, and then gets quietly dropped when it becomes inconvenient for the plot. That is not unusual for genre television, but it is noticeable, especially when the show has otherwise demonstrated that it can be quite disciplined about its own internal logic. When the world building works, it is genuinely immersive. When it does not, you can feel the seams. The Forbidden Soul mark itself is the most consistently well-handled piece of the mythology. The show takes its time revealing the mark's history, its origins, and its implications. There are layers to what this mark means that unfold gradually over the course of the series, and each new revelation reframes what you thought you understood about it earlier. Without spoiling the specifics, I will say that the mark's connection to the broader cosmology of the show, to the nature of the gods and goddesses who exist in this world, is more complex than the initial setup suggests. What seems like a simple power-up mechanic turns out to be something with enormous implications for the entire spiritual order of the world. And the fact that Luke, a seemingly insignificant person, is at the center of that disruption gives the story a sense of scale that grows organically rather than being forced. Now let me talk about the visual presentation, because this is an area where the show has some really striking highs and some noticeable lows. At its best, Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi looks genuinely gorgeous. There is a sequence early in the series where Luke first activates the Forbidden Soul mark, and the visual representation of that moment is stunning. The color palette shifts dramatically, the lighting takes on an almost otherworldly quality, and there is a use of negative space in the framing that makes the whole scene feel like a painting. You can tell that the creative team poured a disproportionate amount of their visual budget into that sequence, and it pays off. It is the kind of moment that makes you sit up and pay attention, because it signals that the show has visual ambitions beyond what you might expect. The character designs for the supernatural beings are another highlight. Each one has a distinct visual identity that reflects their personality and power. The show uses color symbolism in interesting ways, particularly in how it contrasts the muted, institutional tones of the Academy with the vibrant, almost overwhelming palette of the supernatural world. When Luke is inside the Academy's walls, everything feels controlled, structured, slightly gray. When he is in the presence of his contracted companions, the world around them blooms. That is a deliberate visual choice, and it reinforces the thematic point that the Academy's definition of order is actually a kind of suppression. However, there are stretches of the show, particularly in the middle episodes, where the visual quality dips noticeably. Action sequences that should feel dynamic and impactful end up feeling stiff and under-animated. There is a fight scene around the midpoint of the series that involves one of Luke's companions defending him against a group of Academy elites, and the concept of the scene is fantastic, but the execution does not fully deliver. The choreography is readable, but it lacks the weight and impact that the dramatic build-up deserves. You can feel the gap between what the scene wanted to be and what it actually achieved. That inconsistency in visual quality is a recurring pattern. The show clearly has moments of genuine artistry, but it also has stretches where it looks like the production was under time pressure or budget constraints, and the result is a viewing experience that can feel a bit uneven from one episode to the next. The music, on the other hand, is more consistently strong. The show has a main theme that I would describe as haunting and beautiful, built around a melodic motif that recurs in different arrangements throughout the series. There is a particular version of the theme that plays during emotional scenes between Luke and his companions, and it uses strings and a solo vocal line in a way that is genuinely moving. It is the kind of score that works on you slowly. The first time you hear it, you might not think much of it, but by the fifth or sixth time it recurs, it has become emotionally loaded with all the context of everything you have seen. The sound design more broadly deserves credit for knowing when to use silence. There are several key moments where the show strips away music entirely and lets the ambient sound, or the lack of it, do the emotional work. Those moments of quiet are often more powerful than the big, sweeping musical cues, because they force you to sit with the characters in their most vulnerable states. I want to talk for a moment about the pacing, because this is another area where the show's ambitions sometimes outpace its execution. The overall arc of the series is well structured. The early episodes establish the world and Luke's lowly position. The middle episodes develop the bonds and begin to reveal the larger implications of the Forbidden Soul mark. The later episodes escalate the stakes dramatically, bringing the Academy's power structure into direct conflict with the growing power of Luke and his companions. That arc makes sense, and when the show moves between those phases with confidence, the pacing works. But there are individual episodes, particularly in the first half of the series, where the pacing drags. There are episodes that feel like they exist primarily to fill time, to hit a runtime target rather than because the story demands another 30 or 40 minutes of content. You can usually feel it when this is happening because the episode will introduce a minor subplot, spend significant time on it, and then resolve it in a way that does not meaningfully affect anything going forward. It is filler, and while it is not disastrous, it is noticeable, especially in a show that is otherwise capable of being quite efficient with its storytelling. The pacing improves significantly in the second half. Once the show commits to its larger story, the episodes become tighter, more focused, and more propulsive. The final stretch, without getting into specifics, has a momentum that the early episodes sometimes lack. It feels like the creative team found their rhythm as the series progressed, and the result is a back half that is considerably stronger than the front half. Now, I want to dig into something that I think is going to be divisive among viewers, and that is the show's treatment of its female characters. Because this is where I have genuinely mixed feelings, and I want to be fair about it. On one hand, as I have already said, several of the women in this show are among its best written characters. Their individual arcs are compelling, their motivations are complex, and the performances bring real depth to roles that could easily have been shallow. The show deserves real credit for that. When it focuses on these characters as individuals, when it gives them scenes that are about their own stories rather than their relationship to Luke, the results are often the best material in the entire series. On the other hand, there is a structural issue baked into the premise that the show never fully resolves. The Forbidden Soul mark, by its nature, places Luke at the center of these women's stories. They enter his orbit because of the contract. Their power growth is linked to him. Their presence in the narrative is, at some fundamental level, defined by their connection to the male protagonist. And while the show works hard to give them agency within that framework, to show them making choices and driving events, the framework itself is inherently limiting. There are moments where you can feel the show straining against the constraints of its own premise, wanting to give these characters full independence but unable to fully escape the gravity well of the harem-adjacent structure. This is not a problem unique to this show. It is a tension that exists in a huge amount of fantasy fiction, particularly in the subgenre that involves male protagonists with multiple female companions. But the fact that Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi is clearly aware of this tension, clearly trying to push against it, makes the moments where it fails to do so more noticeable and more frustrating. It is like watching a runner who is clearly capable of a faster pace occasionally stumble. The stumbles hurt more because you know what they are capable of when they are moving at full speed. And I think this connects back to the question embedded in the show's title. Who is the monster? The show suggests, at various points, that the real monsters are not the supernatural beings that the world fears, but the systems and institutions that categorize, control, and suppress. The Academy, with its rigid hierarchies and its fear of the forbidden, is arguably more monstrous than anything Luke's soul mark could conjure. And the women who bond with Luke are, in their own ways, also victims of monstrous systems, beings who have been marginalized, feared, or controlled by forces larger than themselves. That thematic layer gives the show a depth that surprised me. It is not just a power fantasy. It is not just a romantic adventure. It is, at its best, a story about how systems of power create the very monsters they claim to be protecting against. And that is a theme that resonates well beyond the specific genre conventions the show is working within. But let me be real with you for a second. Not every viewer is going to care about thematic depth. Some people are coming to this show because they want to see cool supernatural battles and attractive characters and an underdog protagonist who rises to the top. And that is completely valid. The show serves that audience too, and it serves them reasonably well. The action, when it is on, is exciting. The character designs are appealing. The power progression is satisfying. There is genuine pleasure in watching Luke go from the weakest person in the Academy to someone that even the gods are paying attention to. The question is whether the show can do both, be a satisfying genre experience and also be a thoughtful exploration of its own themes. And my honest answer is, sometimes. When it hits, it really hits. The emotional peaks are high. The thematic resonance is real. The characters are worth caring about. But the inconsistency, the uneven pacing, the visual dips, the occasional retreat into genre cliches, those things hold it back from being the best version of itself. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier, about a specific character whose dry wit and sharp tongue provide some of the show's best comedic moments. Without naming names, because her introduction is part of the fun, there is a companion who joins Luke's circle in the middle portion of the series, and she is an absolute scene stealer. Her personality is essentially the opposite of what you might expect from a character in a show like this. She is irreverent, self-aware, and constantly making meta-commentary on the absurdity of the situations she finds herself in. She knows she is in a story that follows certain conventions, and she is not impressed by any of it. What makes her work is that the show uses her humor not just for comic relief but as a defense mechanism. When you eventually learn more about her backstory, her constant joking takes on a different color. It becomes clear that her humor is how she copes with a past that was genuinely painful, and the show handles that reveal with a light touch that makes it land harder than it would have if they had been heavy-handed about it. She goes from being the funny one to being one of the most emotionally resonant characters in the entire cast, and the transition is so gradual that you do not realize it is happening until you are already deeply invested. That kind of character work is what elevates this show above the sum of its parts. It is not consistent. Not every character gets that level of care. Not every arc reaches that depth. But the moments when it does are genuinely affecting, and they are the reason I am sitting here making this video instead of dismissing the show as just another entry in a crowded genre. Let me talk about the antagonist situation for a moment, because the show's approach to antagonists is one of its more interesting structural choices. In a lot of fantasy academy stories, you have a clear villain, someone who opposes the protagonist from a position of power, and the story builds toward a definitive confrontation with that person. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi does not exactly follow that pattern. It has antagonistic forces, certainly. There are people and institutions that stand in Luke's way. But the show is more interested in systemic antagonism than individual villainy. The Academy itself, as I mentioned, is the primary source of opposition. Not because there is one evil dean or one corrupt instructor pulling all the strings, but because the entire system is designed to produce hierarchy and maintain it. The people who benefit from that system are not necessarily evil, they are just invested in the status quo. And the people who are crushed by it are not necessarily good, they are just desperate. That moral ambiguity gives the conflict a texture that is more interesting than a simple good versus evil framework. There are individual characters who serve antagonistic roles, and some of them are more compelling than others. The best of them are the ones who believe they are doing the right thing, who have internalized the Academy's values so completely that they genuinely see Luke and his forbidden mark as existential threats. Their opposition comes from a place of conviction, not malice, and that makes them harder to dismiss and more satisfying to watch. The weakest antagonistic characters are the ones who are simply cruel for the sake of being cruel, the bully archetypes who exist primarily to give Luke someone to overcome in the short term. These characters serve a functional purpose in the plot, but they lack the depth that the show's better antagonists have. They feel like holdovers from a simpler version of the story, and whenever the show focuses on them for too long, you can feel the quality dip slightly. Now, there is a specific dynamic I want to explore, because it is one of the things that makes this show genuinely interesting to think about, even in moments when it is not entirely successful in execution. And that is the power dynamic between Luke and his contracted companions. The Forbidden Soul mark creates a bond. That bond is, by definition, a form of connection between beings of unequal power. Luke, at least initially, is significantly weaker than the beings he contracts with. They are goddesses, or beings with goddess-level power. He is a human who was considered the weakest among his peers. The contract gives him access to their power, but it also creates a relationship where both parties are, in some sense, dependent on each other. They need the bond. He needs the bond. But the nature of that need, and what it means for their autonomy, is something the show keeps coming back to. And this is where the writing is at its most interesting and its most uneven. Because the show clearly wants these relationships to feel equal, to feel like partnerships rather than ownership. And in many scenes, it succeeds. There are moments of genuine reciprocity, where Luke and his companions make decisions together, where the power flows in both directions, where the emotional intimacy is built on mutual respect and shared vulnerability. But there are also moments where the structural inequality of the premise reasserts itself, where Luke's role as the contractor, as the one whose mark enables these bonds, gives him a kind of narrative centrality that the women in his circle cannot escape. Even when the show tries to give them equal footing, the fact remains that the story is called Monster. Terikat Dengan Dewi and not the goddesses and the boy they tolerate star. Luke is the center. The show is his story. And that fundamental structure is both the source of the show's power and the source of its most significant limitations. I think what saves the show, more often than not, is the sincerity of its emotional moments. When Luke and a companion share a scene that is genuinely vulnerable, when they drop their guards and admit fear or doubt or affection, those scenes feel real. They feel like they matter. And that is not something you can fake. The actors sell it. The writing supports it. The music underscores it without overwhelming it. Those moments are the heart of the show, and they are what keep me coming back even when the less successful elements are frustrating me. Let me take a step back and think about the show in the context of its genre and its moment. We are in a time when Fantasy Academy content is absolutely everywhere. Across anime, live-action drama, web novels, and adaptations of every kind, the genre is oversaturated. For a new entry to stand out, it needs to do something that distinguishes it, something that makes it more than just another iteration of the same basic formula. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi distinguishes itself in a few ways. Its emotional sincerity is one. Its willingness to interrogate its own premise is another. Its visual ambitions, even when they are not fully realized, signal a creative team that is reaching for something beyond the minimum. And its treatment of its female characters, imperfect as it is at least engaged with the challenge of writing women as people rather than archetypes. But it also falls into some of the traps that its genre peers fall into. Pacing issues. Uneven visual quality. Occasional reliance on tired tropes. Moments where the show seems unsure whether it wants to be a thoughtful character drama or a straightforward power fantasy, and tries to be both without fully committing to either. That tension between ambition and execution is, I think, the most honest way to describe this show's overall quality. It is not a masterpiece. It is not a disaster. It is a show that is often very good, occasionally great, and sometimes frustratingly mediocre, sometimes all within the same episode. And I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters in the context of this review. The fact that this show exists at all, that it is a production from Indonesia exploring this particular genre with this level of ambition and this kind of budget, is significant. The Indonesian drama industry has been growing and evolving rapidly, and shows like this are part of that evolution. They are pushing into genre territory that has traditionally been dominated by Japanese, Korean, and Chinese productions, and they are doing it with their own cultural flavor and their own creative sensibilities. That does not mean the show should get a pass for its weaknesses. It should be judged on its own merits. But it does mean that the context in which it exists is worth acknowledging, because it helps explain both the show's ambitions and its limitations. When you are working in a genre space that is heavily defined by productions from countries with much larger and more established entertainment industries, there is pressure to both match those productions and differentiate from them. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi handles that pressure in interesting ways. It borrows some of the visual language and narrative structures of its genre peers, but it filters them through a sensibility that feels distinctly its own. The emotional register is different. The humor has a different rhythm. The relationship dynamics have a different texture. Those differences are not always dramatic, but they are consistent enough to give the show an identity that is more than the sum of its genre influences. Now I want to dig a little deeper into the middle portion of the series, because this is where a lot of the show's most interesting and most frustrating material lies. The early episodes have the advantage of novelty, everything is new, the world is being built, the characters are being introduced, and there is a natural momentum that comes from the audience's desire to understand how this world works. The late episodes have the advantage of stakes, everything the show has built is coming to a head, the conflicts are escalating, and the resolutions are approaching. But the middle is where shows live or die, where the novelty has worn off and the final stakes have not yet fully materialized, and it is in this crucible that a show's true quality is revealed. The middle section of Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi is where I found myself most often impressed and most often frustrated in equal measure. There are episodes in this stretch that contain some of the show's best individual scenes and some of its most tedious stretches of filler. It is as if the creative team had more great ideas than they had episodes to fill, and they padded the middle to give themselves time to set up the later payoffs. One of the things that works best in this section is the deepening of the bonds between Luke and his companions. This is where the show moves beyond the initial formation of each contract and starts exploring what it means to actually live with these connections. Because a contract is, in essence, a promise. And promises are easy to make but hard to keep, especially when the circumstances around you are changing, when new pressures are being applied, and when the people involved are growing in directions they did not anticipate. There is a storyline in the middle of the series involving one of Luke's companions and a figure from her past that is, without question, the emotional peak of the show's first half. I do not want to give too much away, but I will say that it involves a reckoning with a history of loss, and it forces both the companion and Luke to confront the limits of what their bond can and cannot heal. The companion in question has to face the fact that her contract with Luke, powerful as it is, cannot undo what has been done to her. It cannot restore what was taken. It can only offer a new path forward, and that path requires her to let go of something she has been holding onto for a very long time. The scenes that deal with this storyline are extraordinary. The acting is raw and specific. The writing is restrained in exactly the right ways, trusting the performers to communicate what the dialogue does not say. And the direction, the way the camera moves, the way silence is used, the way the score enters and exits, all of it comes together to create something that feels genuinely transcendent. If the entire show operated at this level, we would be talking about one of the best fantasy dramas in recent memory. But it does not operate at that level consistently. For every scene of that caliber, there are 2 or 3 scenes that are perfectly competent but unremarkable. Exposition scenes that do their job without distinction. Action sequences that are adequate without being exciting. Character interactions that advance the plot without deepening the relationships. These scenes are not bad. They are just not special. And in a show that has demonstrated it is capable of being special, the merely competent scenes feel like a greater disappointment than they would in a show that had never shown that potential. This is, I think, the fundamental paradox of reviewing Monster. Terikat Dengan Dewi star. The show's peaks are high enough that they raise your expectations, and those raised expectations make the valleys feel lower than they objectively are. A mediocre scene in this show feels worse than a mediocre scene in a show that is consistently mediocre, because you know what this team can do when they are firing on all cylinders. I also want to talk about the show's approach to world building through culture and ritual, because this is one of its more distinctive elements. The world of Asgard Academy is not just a generic fantasy setting with a different name. There are cultural practices, rituals, and traditions that give the world a sense of lived-in authenticity. The way students interact with their instructors. The ceremonies that mark academic milestones, the social norms around spiritual power and its display, all of these details create a world that feels like it existed before the story started and will continue to exist after it ends. The show is particularly good at using these cultural details to reinforce its themes. The rituals of the Academy, for example, presented as elegant and impressive on the surface, but the show gradually reveals them as mechanisms of social control. The ceremonies that celebrate power are also ceremonies that reinforce hierarchy. The traditions that seem beautiful and ancient are also traditions that exclude and marginalize. That gradual unveiling of the darker side of tradition is handled with a subtlety that I found very effective. And the show uses food, clothing, architecture, and other environmental details to build its world in ways that feel organic rather than expository. There are scenes set in communal dining areas where the food on the table tells you something about the social dynamics of the characters present. There are costume choices that reflect character development. As Luke grows in power and confidence, his visual presentation changes in ways that are noticeable but not heavy-handed. These are the kinds of details that separate a show that is merely telling a story from a show that is building a world. But I keep coming back to that tension, that gap between what the show is capable of and what it consistently delivers. And I think the best way to understand that gap is to look at the show's relationship with its own genre. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi is, at its core, a genre piece. It is working within the conventions of fantasy academy drama, harem-adjacent power fantasy, and supernatural romance. It did not invent these genres, and it does not pretend to. But it clearly has ambitions that extend beyond the boundaries of those genres. It wants to say something about power, about autonomy, about the way institutions shape and constrain individuals. It wants to create characters who feel real and relationships that feel earned. And it wants to do all of this while still delivering the genre thrills that its audience is looking for, the cool powers, the dramatic confrontations, the romantic tension, the rising stakes action. That is a lot to ask of any show, and it is perhaps especially a lot to ask of a show that is also navigating the commercial realities of its market and its medium. The show needs to attract viewers. It needs to keep them watching. It needs to deliver the kind of content that generates discussion and engagement. And sometimes those commercial imperatives are in tension with the creative ambitions. I am not saying this to excuse the show's weaknesses. I am saying it to contextualize them. When the show retreats into a familiar trope or a safe genre beat, it is not always because the writers lack the imagination to do something more interesting. Sometimes it is because they are making a calculated decision about what their audience wants and needs at that particular moment in the story. And sometimes, honestly, those calculated decisions are correct. Sometimes the audience does need a lighter moment after a heavy stretch. Sometimes a familiar beat provides a comfort and a rhythm that makes the more daring moments hit harder by contrast. The question is one of proportion. How much of the show can be safe, familiar territory before it starts to feel like a show that is coasting on genre conventions rather than pushing against them? And where exactly that line falls is going to be different for every viewer. Someone who watches a lot of this genre might find the familiar beats comforting and the fresh moments exciting. Someone who is newer to the genre might find even the familiar beats fresh, and the show's more ambitious moments might blow them away. Someone who is primarily a critic might focus on the gap between potential and execution and find the show frustrating. I think all of those reactions are valid. And I think the show is rich enough and human enough to support all of those readings. Let me take a moment to talk about one more aspect of the show that I think deserves attention, and that is its treatment of vulnerability. Because for all its power fantasies and supernatural spectacle, this is a show that is deeply interested in what it means to be vulnerable. Luke is vulnerable. He starts the show vulnerable, and in many ways, he remains vulnerable throughout it, even as he gains power. His companions are vulnerable in their own ways. The Academy itself is vulnerable, though it would never admit it. The Forbidden Soul mark is, in its essence, a mechanism of vulnerability. It creates bonds, and bonds mean exposure. When you are connected to someone, they can see you. They can hurt you. They can leave. The mark does not protect against any of that. It simply makes the connection possible and forces both parties to deal with the consequences. The show's best moments are the ones where it takes vulnerability seriously, where it treats emotional exposure as a kind of courage. And its weakest moments are the ones where it treats vulnerability as a problem to be solved through power-up mechanics or comedic deflection. When a character is hurting and the show lets them hurt, without rushing to fix it or make it funny, those are the moments that linger. When a character is hurting and the show resolves it too quickly, or sidesteps it with a genre beat, those are the moments that feel like missed opportunities. There is a conversation between Luke and one of his companions that happens late in the middle section of the series, and it is one of the most honest depictions of emotional vulnerability I have seen in genre television. It is a simple scene. Two people sitting in a room, talking. No special effects, no dramatic lighting, no swelling music. Just two characters being honest with each other about what they are afraid of and what they need. And the scene is devastating in its simplicity. It works because the show has earned it, because we have spent enough time with these characters to understand what it costs them to be this open with each other. And it works because the actors play it with a rawness that feels unperformative, like they are discovering the emotions in real time rather than executing a predetermined emotional beat. That scene is the show at its absolute best. It is everything the show is capable of when all of its elements are aligned: the writing, the acting, the restraint, the emotional honesty, the thematic resonance. And it is the scene I keep coming back to when I am trying to articulate why this show, despite its flaws, has stuck with me. Because here is the thing about *Monster. Terikat Dengan Dewi * that I keep circling around. It is not a perfect show. It is not even a consistently good show. But it is a show that cares. You can feel the care in the best scenes, in the character work, in the visual choices, in the thematic ambition. You can feel that the people who made this show wanted it to be something meaningful, something that transcended the limitations of its genre. And they did not always succeed. But they tried, and the trying is evident, and the moments when they did succeed are genuinely special. I realize I have been talking for a while now, and we have covered a lot of ground. But I want to spend a bit more time on a few specific elements before we start moving toward the bigger picture. The show's use of flashback and non-linear storytelling is worth discussing, because it is both one of its most effective tools and one of its most occasionally frustrating habits. The show uses flashbacks extensively, particularly in its middle section, to fill in the backstories of Luke's companions. Each major companion gets at least one extended flashback sequence that explains who they were before the contract, what they have lost, and why the bond with Luke matters to them on a personal level. The best of these flashbacks are the ones that recontextualize the present. When you learn about a companion's past and then watch their present-day scenes with new eyes, understanding what is driving their behavior beneath the surface, the result is a richer, more layered viewing experience. The show earns these moments because it is patient enough to let the mystery build before revealing the answer. You spend episodes wondering why a particular companion behaves a certain way, and when the flashback finally explains it, the explanation is satisfying and emotionally resonant. But some of the flashbacks feel more functional than inspired. They exist to deliver necessary exposition rather than to deepen character. They are competently executed, but they lack the emotional charge of the best flashback sequences. And their placement in the narrative sometimes disrupts the momentum of the present-day storyline in ways that feel counterproductive. There is a particular flashback sequence that I think exemplifies both the strengths and weaknesses of the show's approach. It involves a companion whose past is tied to a significant event in the world's history, an event that has ramifications for the larger plot. The content of the flashback is genuinely interesting. It expands the world building, deepens the character, and sets up important future developments. But the timing of the flashback, inserted right in the middle of a tense present-day sequence, creates a tonal whiplash that undercuts both the tension of the present and the emotional impact of the past. It is a case where the individual scene is strong but its placement in the larger structure is questionable. This speaks to a broader structural issue with the show, which is that its episode-to-episode pacing sometimes prioritizes individual scene quality over overall narrative flow. Scenes that are great in isolation can disrupt the rhythm of the episode they are placed in, and episodes that are individually strong can feel disconnected from the episodes around them. The show does not always have the seamless structural flow that the best long-form dramas achieve, where each episode feels like a necessary chapter in a continuous story rather than a self-contained unit. That said, the overall arc does work. When you step back and look at the series as a whole, the story moves from point A to point B in a way that makes sense and builds momentum. The individual structural hiccups become less noticeable in the context of the full journey, and the emotional payoffs at the end of the series land because the cumulative effect of everything that came before has built up enough weight to make them matter. I think one of the things I find most interesting about the show is how it handles the concept of power itself. In a lot of fantasy fiction, power is straightforward, more is better, and the protagonist's goal is to accumulate as much of it as possible. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi is more ambivalent about power. The Forbidden Soul mark gives Luke power, yes. But it also gives him responsibility, danger, and a kind of isolation that increases in proportion to his strength. The more powerful he becomes, the more he is feared. The more he is feared, the more the institutional forces array against him intensify. And the more those forces intensify, the more pressure is placed on the bonds he has formed with his companions. There is a point in the story where Luke's growing power actually threatens to destroy the very relationships that gave him that power in the first place. The contracts that made him strong are also the contracts that make him a target, and being a target puts everyone around him in danger. It is a classic paradox of power, and the show explores it with a nuance that I found genuinely thought-provoking. Luke has to grapple with the question of whether his pursuit of strength is worth the cost, not to himself, but to the people he cares about. And the show does not offer an easy answer. This connects to the title question once again. Is Luke a monster? He possesses a forbidden power. He has bound beings to him through contracts that the established order considers dangerous. he is disrupting the hierarchy of the Academy and, by extension, the broader power structure of the world. From the perspective of those in power, he is absolutely a monster. But from the perspective of the beings who have chosen to bond with him, he is something else entirely. He is a partner, an anchor, a source of connection in a world that has tried to isolate them. The monster question is not answered with a simple yes or no. It is held in tension throughout the entire series, and that tension is one of the show's most compelling through lines. Now let me talk about a moment that I think illustrates the show's best qualities in microcosm. There is a scene, and I will describe it in enough detail to convey its impact without giving away its full context, where Luke and one of his companions are in a place of relative safety after a particularly intense sequence of events. They are both exhausted, both processing what has happened, and neither of them is sure what comes next. The companion asks Luke a question, a simple question about whether he is afraid, and his answer is not a heroic declaration. It is a quiet, honest admission that yes, he is afraid, and that he does not know if what he is doing is right, and that the only thing he is sure of is that he does not want to face what is coming alone. That scene works on multiple levels. It is a character moment that deepens both Luke and the companion. It is a thematic statement about the nature of courage and connection. It is a structural turning point that redefines the stakes of the story going forward. And it is, simply, a beautifully acted and directed scene that trusts its audience to sit with the quiet and the uncertainty. It does not rush to resolve the tension. It does not offer reassurance. It just lets two people be honest with each other in a moment of fear, and it trusts that honesty to be enough. That is the show I fell in love with, in those moments. Not the action, not the spectacle, not the power fantasies, but those moments of raw human connection that exist at the center of all the genre machinery. And it is the show I wish I saw more consistently. Because for every scene like that, there is a scene that is perfectly adequate but unremarkable. A training montage that hits all the expected beats without adding anything new. A rival confrontation that escalates and resolves exactly as you would predict. A world-building exposition dump that informs but does not illuminate. These scenes are the connective tissue of the show, and they do their job. But they are not the reason you remember the show afterward. I keep coming back to this tension because I think it is the most honest thing I can say about the show. It is brilliant in moments. It is competent in stretches. And it is frustrating precisely because the brilliant moments prove that the competent stretches did not have to be merely competent. Let me shift gears a little and talk about the show's relationship with its audience, because I think this is an important piece of the puzzle. Asterisk monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi asterisk is, fundamentally, a show that knows its audience. It understands that a significant portion of its viewership is coming for the genre thrills, the power progression, the romantic dynamics, the supernatural spectacle. And it delivers on those expectations with reasonable consistency. The show gives its audience what it came for, and it does so with enough craft and sincerity that the delivery feels satisfying rather than perfunctory. But the show also wants to be more than what its audience expects. It wants to challenge, to provoke, to make its viewers think and feel things they did not sign up for. And this is where the balancing act gets tricky. Because the audience that came for genre thrills might not be interested in a quiet, two-character conversation about the nature of fear. And the audience that came for thematic depth might be bored by the training montages and rival confrontations. The show is trying to serve two masters, and it does not always succeed in satisfying either one fully. I think the ideal viewer for this show is someone who loves the genre but is also hungry for something more within it. Someone who watches Fantasy Academy dramas and wishes they would go deeper, take their characters more seriously, ask harder questions about the worlds they create. That viewer will find a lot to love here, even in the show's weaker moments, because they will see the ambition beneath the execution and appreciate the effort even when the result falls short. The less ideal viewer is someone who wants pure genre entertainment without the thematic baggage, or someone who wants pure thematic depth without the genre conventions. This show will frustrate both of those viewers, because it is always partially committed to the thing they do not want. It is always a little too thoughtful for the pure genre fan and a little too generic for the pure art house viewer. It lives in the middle, and while the middle can be a rich and rewarding place to be, it is also a place where you are always partially disappointing everyone. And that, I think, is the most fundamental truth about Monster? Ako Terikat Dengan Dewi star. It is a show that lives in the middle. Between ambition and execution. Between genre convention and thematic depth. Between its best moments and its worst. It is not the show that will convert people to the genre, and it is not the show that will transcend the genre entirely. It is the show that exists within the genre and pushes against its walls, sometimes breaking through and sometimes bouncing back. Whether that is enough to make the show worth your time depends entirely on what you are looking for and how much the middle ground appeals to you. For me, and I acknowledge that this is a personal judgment, the moments of brilliance are enough to justify the journey. The show's peaks are high enough that I am glad I watched it, and the thematic ambition is genuine enough that I respect it even when it does not fully deliver. But I also understand the viewer who would watch this show and see mostly the flaws, the inconsistent pacing, the uneven visuals, the genre cliches that the show cannot fully escape. That viewer is not wrong. Those things are real. They hold the show back from being what it could be. The question is whether you see the show as what it is or what it almost was. And I do not think there is a right answer to that question. Let me zoom out for a moment and talk about the show's place in the broader landscape of fantasy drama, because I think this is relevant to understanding both its strengths and its limitations. We are living in a golden age of genre television, broadly speaking. Fantasy, science fiction, and supernatural drama are more mainstream, more widely available, and more diverse in their approaches than ever before. From big-budget prestige adaptations to independent web series, the range of genre content available to viewers is staggering. And within that landscape, the Fantasy Academy subgenre occupies a particular niche. It is a subgenre with a passionate fanbase, strong genre conventions, and a set of expectations that both enable and constrain the shows that work within it. Monster? Ako Terikat Dengan Dewi is a product of that landscape. It draws on the conventions of its subgenre, it serves its fanbase, and it also tries to push beyond the established boundaries. And it does so at a time when the bar for genre television has never been higher. When audiences have access to shows with massive budgets, A-list talent, and the full creative resources of major studios, a show like this has to work harder to stand out. It cannot compete on spectacle alone. It has to compete on story, on character, on emotional resonance, on thematic ambition. And I think that competitive pressure is part of what drives the show's best instincts. The desire to be more than just another entry in an oversaturated field pushes the creative team to take risks, to invest in character depth, to explore themes that are bigger than the genre conventions typically allow. Some of those risks pay off beautifully. Others fall flat. But the willingness to take them is, in itself, a mark of creative ambition that I find admirable. At the same time, the show cannot escape the commercial realities of its market. It needs viewers. It needs engagement. It needs to deliver the kind of content that keeps people watching episode after episode. And those needs sometimes pull in the opposite direction of the creative ambitions. The result is a show that is constantly negotiating between what it wants to be and what it needs to be, and that negotiation is visible in almost every aspect of the production. I want to talk about one more specific element before we move on, and that is the show's handling of its academy setting as a metaphor for real-world institutional power. Because I think this is one of the most interesting and most subtle aspects of the show's thematic work. Asgard Academy is not just a school. It is an institution that shapes how its students understand the world, what they value, what they fear, and who they believe they are. It is a place that determines, through its assessments and hierarchies, who has worth and who does not. And for most of the students, that determination is accepted without question. They internalize the Academy's values, they compete within its systems, and they measure themselves by its standards. The Academy does not need to force compliance. It creates a culture in which compliance is the default. Luke's disruption of that culture is not just a power fantasy. It is a challenge to the Academy's authority, not because he is trying to overthrow it, but simply because his existence, with his forbidden mark and his unconventional bonds, proves that the Academy's understanding of power is incomplete. He is evidence that the system does not know everything, that there are forms of strength it cannot categorize or control. And that evidence is threatening, not because Luke is dangerous in himself, but because the idea that the system might be wrong is dangerous. If the system can be wrong about Luke, it can be wrong about anything. And if it can be wrong about anything, then the entire hierarchy that the students have built their identities around might be a lie. That is a powerful thematic idea, and the show handles it with more nuance than I expected. It does not make the Academy cartoonishly evil. It does not frame the system as entirely corrupt. Instead, it shows a system that is functional but flawed, well-intentioned but rigid, and ultimately more interested in preserving its own authority than in genuinely serving its students. That is a more honest and more interesting portrayal of institutional power than the simple, evil institution trope that a lot of genre fiction relies on. And the show is honest about the fact that dismantling a system, even a flawed one, has consequences. Luke's challenge to the Academy's hierarchy is not portrayed as an unambiguous good. It creates chaos. It puts people at risk. It destabilizes structures that, for all their flaws, were providing a kind of order and predictability. The show acknowledges that change is messy and that the people who benefit from the old system are not necessarily villains, they are just people who are afraid of what comes next. That thematic maturity is one of the show's most underappreciated qualities. It does not preach. It does not simplify. It presents a complicated situation and trusts its audience to engage with the complexity. And when it does that well, it elevates the entire show above the level of its genre peers. I think I have said enough about the specific elements of the show for now. I want to take a step back and talk about how my experience of watching the show evolved over time, because I think the trajectory of a viewer's experience is itself an interesting and relevant piece of commentary. I came to this show with low expectations. The premise sounded like standard genre fare. The title did not inspire confidence in anything beyond the most basic level, and the genre conventions it was working within are not my usual area of deep interest. I expected to be entertained but not moved. I expected competence but not ambition. The first few episodes did not challenge those expectations. They were solid, engaging, well-made, but they felt like exactly what I had expected, a well-executed genre piece with good production values and likable characters. I was enjoying myself, but I was not thinking about the show when I was not watching it. It was occupying a comfortable, unremarkable space in my viewing rotation. The shift happened gradually. Somewhere around the middle of the series, I started noticing that the show was doing things I had not expected. The character work was deeper than the genre required. The thematic ambitions were more serious than the premise suggested. The emotional moments were landing harder than they had any right to. And I found myself, almost against my will, becoming genuinely invested in the story and its characters. By the time I reached the later episodes, I was actively thinking about the show between viewings. I was anticipating the next episode not because of plot momentum, but because I wanted to spend more time with these characters, in this world, exploring these ideas. That is a rare experience. And it is one of the things that makes reviewing shows like this so rewarding. The shows that surprise you, that exceed your expectations, that make you rethink your assumptions about what a genre can do, those are the shows that stick with you. This show stuck with me. Not because it is perfect, but because it reached higher than it needed to, and when it connected deeply. And I think that is a more important quality than consistency. A show that is consistently mediocre will be forgotten. A show that is inconsistently brilliant will be remembered for its best moments, even if the worst moments are disappointing. An asterisk monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi asterisk is, for better or worse, a show of moments. Some of them are transcendent. Some of them are forgettable. But the transcendent ones are the ones that stay with you, and they are the reason this show is worth talking about. Now, before we get into the later parts of the series and the bigger picture, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the production side of things, because I think the context of how this show was made matters to understanding what it achieved. Producing a show in the fantasy genre is expensive. The visual effects, the set design, the costume design, the choreography, all of it costs money, and all of it requires time and expertise. For a production operating outside the biggest entertainment markets, these constraints are even more significant. And I think asterisk monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi * is a show that was clearly made with passion and skill but also clearly made within real resource constraints. The moments where the show looks best, the visual effects sequences, the carefully designed sets, the elaborate costumes, these are moments where the production team's talent is on full display. You can see the artistry, the attention to detail, the commitment to creating something that looks and feels premium. But you can also see the scenes in moments where the budget stretches thin, action sequences that rely more on editing tricks than on choreography, set designs that reuse locations in ways that become noticeable, visual effects that vary in quality from scene to scene. These production realities are not criticisms of the creative team. They are constraints within which the creative team had to operate, and the fact that the show achieves as much as it does within those constraints is a testament to the skill and dedication of everyone involved. But they are part of the viewing experience, and they contribute to the inconsistency that is the show's most persistent flaw. The sound production, on the other hand, is consistently excellent. Whether it is the music, the sound effects, or the overall audio mix, the show sounds great from beginning to end. The score, as I mentioned earlier, is one of its most reliable strengths, and the sound design does an enormous amount of work in creating atmosphere and emotional resonance. In moments where the visuals are not quite reaching the level the scene needs, the audio often picks up the slack, and the result is that even visually weaker scenes can still land emotionally if the sound is doing its job. I think this points to something important about the show's creative priorities. The team clearly prioritized the elements that would have the most emotional impact: the writing, the performances, the music, the core character work. The visual spectacle, while important, was secondary to the emotional and narrative substance. And that prioritization was, I think, the right call. A show that looked gorgeous but had shallow characters and a hollow story would be forgettable in a way that this show is not. The investment in emotional authenticity pays dividends that more investment in visual effects probably would not. Alright. I have been going on for quite a while, and I want to make sure we have enough room to cover the later episodes and the show's overall arc in detail. So let me start transitioning toward that territory, while acknowledging that we have a lot more to discuss about the show's middle section. We will be coming back to some of these themes as we move into the later parts of the story, because the show's final stretch is where a lot of its earlier setup starts to pay off, and the way those payoffs land is crucial to evaluating the show as a whole. The shift from the middle section to the final stretch of the series is one of the most interesting structural transitions I have encountered in genre television recently. It is not a sudden shift. There is no clear dividing line where one phase ends and another begins. Instead, the transition happens gradually, as the various storylines that the show has been developing in its middle section start to converge, as the stakes begin to escalate, and as the consequences of Luke's choices start to catch up with him in ways that are both inevitable and surprising. One of the things that the show does well in this transition is maintaining its focus on character even as the plot momentum increases. A lesser show would sacrifice character depth for plot speed at this point, rushing through emotional beats to get to the next action sequence or dramatic revelation. This show does not do that. It continues to prioritize the emotional lives of its characters, even as the events around them become more intense and more dangerous. And that commitment to character is what makes the final stretch as effective as it is. Because by the time you reach the later episodes, you have spent enough time with these characters to care about what happens to them. You understand their fears, their desires, their vulnerabilities. You have watched them grow and struggle and change. And when the show puts them in danger, or forces them to make impossible choices, those moments land because of the investment you have built up over the course of the series. The emotional stakes feel real because they are grounded in real character development, not just plot mechanics. There is a particular sequence in the later episodes that I think is the best thing the show does, period. It involves Luke facing a consequence of his forbidden soul mark that he did not anticipate, cost of the power that he had not considered. Without spoiling the specifics, I will say that it forces him to confront the fundamental question of whether the connections he has formed are worth the price, not the price he pays, but the price the people he loves pay. And the answer he arrives at is not a triumphant declaration of yes. It is a complicated, painful, deeply human reckoning with the reality that love and power and connection all come with costs, and that the most honest thing you can do is face those costs rather than pretend they do not exist. The acting in this sequence is extraordinary. The actor playing Luke delivers what I would consider the best performance of the entire series in these scenes. There is a moment where he has to make a decision, and the way he plays the conflict, the way you can see every possible choice warring across his face, the way his body language shifts from one moment to the next as he considers and rejects different options, it is mesmerizing. It is the kind of performance that reminds you why you watch drama in the first place, not for the spectacle, not for the escapism, but for the moments of human truth that great acting can reveal. The other performers rise to the occasion as well. The scenes between Luke and his companions in this stretch are some of the most emotionally raw material in the entire series. There is a confrontation between two of his companions that is simmering with unresolved tension, and when it finally boils over, the result is explosive in a way that is earned by everything the show has built between them. The actresses playing these roles go at each other with a ferocity that feels real, not performed, and the aftermath of their confrontation, when the anger gives way to something more vulnerable and more honest, is handled with a maturity that impressed me. The music in these scenes deserves special mention. The score becomes more restrained as the emotional intensity increases, which is a counterintuitive but effective choice. Instead of swelling to match the drama, the music pulls back, creating space for the performances to breathe and for the silences to carry their own weight. It is a confident choice, because a lesser score would try to tell you how to feel. This score trusts the performances and the writing to do that work, and the result is scenes that feel more intimate and more real than they would with a more aggressive musical accompaniment. As the story moves toward its climactic moments, the show makes some structural choices that I found both bold and slightly frustrating. It is clear that the creative team wanted the ending to feel earned, not rushed, and so they take their time building toward the final confrontations and resolutions. That patience is admirable in principle, and in practice it means that some of the final episodes have a deliberate, almost meditative quality that suits the emotional weight of the story. But it also means that there are moments in the final stretch where the pacing feels slower than the stakes warrant, where you want the show to move faster because the tension is so high, and the show insists on taking its time. That is a minor complaint in the context of what the show achieves in its final episodes, but it is worth noting because it speaks to the show's broader relationship with pacing. The show is at its best when it trusts its audience's patience, when it lets scenes breathe and allows emotions to develop organically. But there is a difference between trusting patience and testing it, and the show occasionally crosses that line in its final stretch. The climax itself, without revealing specifics, is satisfying in ways that surprised me. The show has set up so many different threads, so many different relationships and conflicts and thematic questions, that I was worried about how it would manage to bring them all together. And honestly, it does not bring all of them together. Some threads are resolved more completely than others. Some characters get more satisfying conclusions than others. But the central threads, Luke's journey, the key relationships, the thematic question of what it means to be a monster, those are handled with real care and real conviction. The final resolution of Luke's arc is something I want to praise specifically, because it avoids one of the most common pitfalls of this kind of story. In a lot of power fantasy narratives, the protagonist's journey ends with them becoming the strongest, the most powerful, the most respected. It is an ending that validates the fantasy, the underdog who was nothing becomes everything. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi does not exactly do that. Luke's ending is more complicated, more ambiguous, and ultimately more satisfying than a simple triumph would have been. Without spoiling the specifics, I will say that the show's final statement about Luke is not that he became powerful. It is that he became honest. And that is a much more interesting and much more emotionally resonant place to end his story. The companions' conclusions vary in quality. The strongest companions, the ones who receive the most development throughout the series, get endings that feel earned and satisfying. The weaker companions, the ones whose development was more uneven, get endings that are adequate but not particularly memorable. This unevenness is, in miniature, a reflection of the show's overall quality. Its best elements are excellent, and its weaker elements are merely competent. I want to talk about the final scene of the show, because it is a piece of filmmaking that I think deserves attention. Without revealing what happens, I will say that the show ends on a note that is simultaneously hopeful and melancholic, that looks forward and backward at the same time, and that captures, in a single image, the central emotional truth of the entire series. It is a quiet ending. There is no big spectacle, no dramatic final confrontation in the last 5 minutes. Just a moment of stillness and reflection that asks the audience to hold everything they have seen in their minds and decide for themselves what it meant. I loved that ending. I loved its restraint. I loved its confidence. I loved the fact that the show trusted its audience enough to end on a note of ambiguity rather than resolution. And I think it is the kind of ending that will stay with you, that will make you think about the show long after the credits roll, and that will reward repeat viewings as you notice details and resonances that you missed the first time. Alright. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground here. And I think it is time to start pulling some of these threads together. But before I get into the final verdict, there are a few more things I want to touch on, because I think they are important to understanding the show's overall impact and to helping you decide whether it is worth your time. Let me talk about the show's engagement with its own genre tropes, because this is something that I find fascinating and that I think is central to understanding what the show is trying to do. As I have mentioned, the show is working within a well-established genre with strong conventions and audience expectations. And it is a show that is clearly aware of those conventions, clearly thinking about them, and making deliberate choices about when to follow them and when to subvert them. The most interesting example of this is the way the show handles the trope of the harem protagonist. In the classic version of this trope, the male protagonist accumulates female companions who are all, to varying degrees, romantically interested in him. The story derives entertainment value from the romantic tension, the jealousy dynamics, and the protagonist's awkward navigation of multiple simultaneous relationships. It is a formula that has been used countless times, and it has a proven track record of audience engagement. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi uses this formula but also complicates it. Not all of Luke's companions are romantically interested in him, at least not initially. Some of them enter the contract for entirely non-romantic reasons, and the show is honest about the fact that proximity and emotional intimacy do not automatically equal romantic attraction. This is a small but significant departure from the standard formula, and it gives the show's relationship dynamics a variety and a realism that a more conventional approach would lack. That said, the show does not entirely escape the gravitational pull of the harem trope. Over the course of the series, romantic elements do develop between Luke and several of his companions, and the show handles these developments with varying degrees of success. The best romantic subplots are the ones that feel like natural extensions of the existing character dynamics, where the emotional intimacy deepens gradually and organically into something more. The weakest are the ones that feel like obligatory genre beats, where the romance develops because the formula requires it rather than because the characters have naturally arrived there. This is, I think, the show's most honest struggle with its genre. It wants to be more than the formula, and sometimes it is. But it also needs the formula to attract and retain its audience, and so it is always partially in conversation with the very conventions it is trying to transcend. The result is a show that is doing something more interesting with its genre than most of its peers, but that is also not fully free of the constraints that genre imposes. And I think that is okay. I think there is value in a show that is aware of its genre's limitations and pushes against them, even if it does not fully break free. The pushing itself is meaningful. The attempt to do more, to be more, to ask harder questions, that is worth something even when it does not fully succeed. And it is one of the things that distinguishes Monster. Terikat Dengan Dewi from the many shows in its genre that follow the formula without questioning it. I also want to briefly discuss the fan reception of the show, or at least what I can observe of it, because I think it is relevant to understanding the show's cultural impact and its place in the broader conversation about genre television. From what I can tell, the show has generated a passionate and divided fan base. There are viewers who love it unconditionally, who see it as a breath of fresh air in a stale genre, who connect deeply with its characters and themes, and who celebrate its ambition even when its execution falls short. There are viewers who dislike it intensely, who find it pretentious, who think it tries to be more than its genre allows and ends up being less, who are frustrated by its inconsistency and its inability to fully commit to either its genre thrills or its thematic ambitions. And there are viewers in the middle, like me, who appreciate both its strengths and its weaknesses and try to evaluate it fairly on both counts. The passion of the fanbase, on both sides, is itself a testament to the show's impact. A show that generates no strong feelings one way or the other is a show that has failed to make an impression. A show that generates strong feelings on both sides is a show that has done something worth talking about, even if what it has done is divisive. An asterisk monster? Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi asterisk is, if nothing else, a show worth talking about. The discourse around the show, from what I have observed, tends to center on a few key points of contention. The handling of female characters is one. Is the show genuinely empowering, or does it ultimately reinforce the tropes it claims to subvert? The pacing is another. Is the show's deliberate pace a sign of confidence and depth, or is it a sign of poor structure and unnecessary filler? And the ending is a third. Is the show's ambiguous conclusion a brave artistic choice, or is it a cop-out that refuses to commit to a clear resolution? I have my own opinions on these questions, and I have shared them throughout this review. But I think the fact that the questions are being debated at all is a sign that the show is operating at a level that demands engagement. You do not debate a show that does not matter. You debate a show that is reaching for something, even if you disagree about whether it got there. Let me touch on one more thing before we move toward the wrap-up, and that is the question of who this show is for. Because I think that is an important practical question for anyone considering whether to invest their time in it. If you are a fan of fantasy academy dramas and you are looking for something that does the genre with a bit more emotional depth and thematic ambition than usual, this show is a strong recommendation. It will give you the genre thrills you are looking for while also offering layers and nuances that are rare in the field. You might be frustrated by its inconsistency, but you will almost certainly be impressed by its best moments. If you are not a regular consumer of this genre but you are curious about it, this show is a reasonable entry point, though not the best one. It assumes some familiarity with genre conventions, and while it explains its world well enough to follow, some of its more nuanced genre commentary might be lost on viewers who do not have a reference point for the tropes it is engaging with. If you are new to the genre, you might want to start with something more accessible and come back to this one after you have a broader foundation. If you are someone who generally avoids this genre because you find it shallow or formulaic, this show might surprise you. It is not a complete departure from genre conventions, and it will not convert a committed skeptic. But it is more thoughtful and more emotionally honest than its premise suggests, and it might be worth a look if you are open to having your expectations challenged. And if you are a critic or an analyst of genre television, this show is essential viewing. Not because it is the best example of its genre, but because it is one of the most interesting. It is a show that is actively in conversation with its own conventions, that is trying to push boundaries even when it does not fully succeed, and that raises questions about the relationship between genre, theme, audience expectation, and artistic ambition that are worth thinking about seriously. I think that is enough context setting. Let me start moving toward the bigger picture, the final assessment, the part where I try to pull all of these threads together and give you a clear sense of how I feel about the show overall. But actually, I realize there is one more thing I want to discuss before we get there, and it is something that I have been thinking about throughout this entire review but have not yet articulated directly. And that is the show's title. Asterisk monster? Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi star. Asterisk monster? I am bound to the goddesses. Asterisk. That title is doing a lot of work. On the surface, it is descriptive. The show is about a character who is associated with the word monster and who forms bonds with goddesses. But the more you watch the show, the more the title reveals its layers. The question mark after monster is the show's central thematic inquiry. The phrase, I am bound, is both a statement of connection and a statement of constraint. And the goddesses positions the female characters not as accessories or prizes but as divine beings in their own right, beings to whom the protagonist is bound, not the other way around. The fact that the title positions Luke as the one who is bound, rather than the one who binds, is a subtle but significant choice. It reverses the expected power dynamic of the harem trope, where the male protagonist is typically the center of power around whom the female characters orbit. Here, Luke is bound to them. He is connected to them, dependent on them, shaped by them. And that reversal, whether intentional or not, speaks to the show's broader interest in questioning who holds power and what power really means. I find myself thinking about that title a lot. It is a good title. It is a title that earns its question mark. Now, I want to acknowledge something. I have been talking about this show for a very long time at this point, and I am aware that the length of this review is itself a statement about the show's richness and complexity. A show that is simple and straightforward does not require this much analysis. A show that is mediocre does not inspire this much thought. The fact that I have this much to say about Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi is, in itself, a kind of endorsement. Not of perfection, but of significance. This is a show that matters, that has things to say, and that is worth engaging with seriously. And with that, I think we are ready to start pulling this together. But we still have a lot of ground to cover, because the final assessment of this show is not simple, and I want to make sure I do justice to its complexity. Let me start by talking about what I think the show's legacy will be, or at least what I think its lasting impact is likely to be. Because I think this is a show that will be remembered, not necessarily as a classic, but as an important marker of what is possible within its genre and within its market. The Indonesian drama industry is growing, evolving, and reaching new audiences. Shows like Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi are part of that evolution. They are expanding the range of stories being told, the genres being explored, and the production standards being achieved. And regardless of whether this specific show becomes a beloved classic or a cult favorite or a footnote, it is part of a larger movement that is significant and worth paying attention to. The show's engagement with genre conventions is also noteworthy. It is not the first show to try to transcend the limitations of its genre, and it will not be the last. But it does so with a sincerity and a thoughtfulness that sets it apart from shows that either mindlessly follow the formula or cynically subvert it for shock value. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi loves its genre. It just wants its genre to be better. And that aspiration, even when it falls short, is admirable. I keep thinking about the moments in this show that genuinely moved me. The quiet conversations. The painful admissions. The moments of connection between characters who are afraid and honest and trying their best in a world that does not make it easy. Those moments are the show's true achievement, and they are what I will remember most vividly when I think back on this viewing experience. The spectacle fades. The plot mechanics become less interesting on reflection. The genre conventions blur together with those of 100 other shows. But the human moments linger. The feeling of sitting with characters who feel real, who struggle with things that matter, who grow and change and make mistakes and try again. That is what stays. And that is, ultimately, why I think this show is worth watching, despite its flaws. Not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. Not because it always succeeds, but because it always tries. Not because it transcends its genre, but because it loves its genre enough to want more from it. The monster in the title is not just Luke. It is not just the supernatural beings or the forbidden mark or the disrupted hierarchy. The monster is the fear that you are not enough, that the world is right about you, that the power you have found is not really yours and will eventually be taken away. The monster is the voice inside that says you are a fraud, that your connections are not real, that the people who care about you are only there because of what you can give them, not because of who you are. And the goddesses are not just the supernatural beings who contract with Luke. They are the people who see you clearly, who choose to be connected to you not because of your power but because of your truth. They are the relationships that challenge you, that demand your honesty, that make you better not by making you stronger but by making you more human. That is the story Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi is trying to tell, beneath all the genre machinery and supernatural spectacle. And when it tells that story well, it is genuinely beautiful. Let me keep exploring this, because I think there is more to say about the way the show handles the concept of the forbidden mark and what it represents thematically. The forbidden soul mark is forbidden for a reason. That much is established early on. The Academy and the broader power structures of the world have decided that this particular form of connection is dangerous, unacceptable, and must be suppressed. But as the show gradually reveals, the reasons for that prohibition are not as clear-cut as they initially appear. There are historical reasons, political reasons, and personal reasons why the mark is feared, and the show takes its time unpacking each of them. What emerges is a picture of a world where certain forms of connection are considered acceptable and others are not because of any inherent danger, but because of the threat they pose to the existing power structure. The sanctioned forms of spiritual contract are the ones that can be controlled, regulated, and taxed by the Academy and its allied institutions. The forbidden mark cannot be controlled. It forms bonds that the institution cannot monitor or manage. And that lack of institutional control is what makes it truly dangerous in the eyes of the powerful. This is, of course, a metaphor for any number of real-world situations where institutions suppress forms of connection, expression, or identity that they cannot control. The show is not heavy-handed about this metaphor. It does not draw explicit parallels or make didactic speeches. But the parallel is there for anyone who wants to see it, and it gives the show's fantasy elements a grounding in reality that makes them more resonant. Luke's use of the forbidden mark is, in this light, not just a personal power-up. It is an act of resistance against institutional control. It is a statement that connection does not need to be sanctioned to be valid, that bonds formed outside the approved channels are not inherently less meaningful or less real than those formed within them. And that statement, delivered through the show's genre framework, carries more weight than it would in a more straightforward political drama, because it is embedded in a story that is also entertaining and emotionally engaging on a surface level. The show does not always maintain this thematic clarity. There are moments where the metaphor gets muddled, where the focus shifts to more conventional genre concerns and the thematic underpinning fades into the background. But when the show is firing on all cylinders, when the genre thrills and the thematic depth are aligned, the result is something genuinely powerful. And I think this is what I find most compelling about the show overall. It is a show that uses its genre not as a limitation but as a vehicle. The fantasy academy setting, the supernatural power mechanics, the harem-adjacent relationship dynamics, all of these genre elements are, at their best, serving a larger purpose. They are the language through which the show tells a story about power, connection, identity, and institutional control. And when that language is used fluently, the result is a show that is both entertaining and meaningful. That dual quality, entertainment and meaning, is what I think separates good genre television from great genre television. And while I would not call *Monster Terikat Dengan Dewi great, I would call it genuinely good, with flashes of greatness that hint at what the creative team is capable of achieving. Let me take a moment here to reflect on something I have not yet addressed directly, and that is the cultural specificity of the show. As an Indonesian production, the show brings cultural perspectives, values, and sensibilities that are distinct from those of Japanese, Korean, or Chinese genre productions. And I think these cultural differences are worth acknowledging, not as exotic novelties, but as genuine contributions to the show's identity and its approach to its genre. The way the show handles community and collective identity, for example, feels different from the more individualistic approach common in many East Asian genre productions. Luke's journey is not just his own. It is embedded in a web of relationships and obligations that extend beyond his personal desires. The show is interested in how individuals exist within communities, how personal growth affects collective dynamics, and how community values can both support and constrain individual agency. That perspective gives the show a texture that feels distinctly its own. Similarly, the show's treatment of spiritual and supernatural elements draws on cultural traditions and beliefs that give its world-building a richness and a specificity that generic fantasy settings lack. The Academy's rituals, the nature of the soul mark, the characteristics of the supernatural beings, all of these elements feel grounded in a cultural context that gives them weight and meaning beyond their narrative function. I do not want to overstate this, because the show is also clearly drawing on genre conventions from multiple cultural traditions, and it is not solely or primarily an expression of Indonesian cultural identity. But the cultural specificity is there, and it is one of the things that gives the show its distinctive flavor. In a genre landscape dominated by productions from a few major markets, that distinctiveness is valuable. All right. I think I have been building toward this for a while now, and it is time to start talking about the big picture. The final assessment. The overall verdict. But actually, I want to hold off on that for just a moment longer, because there is one more thing I want to explore, and it is something that gets to the heart of why I make these videos in the first place. I make drama reviews because I believe that stories matter. Not just as entertainment, but as a way of understanding ourselves and each other. The stories we tell, and the stories we consume, shape how we see the world, how we understand our own experiences, and how we relate to the people around us. A good story can make us feel less alone. A great story can change how we think. Asterisk monster? Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi asterisk is not a story that will change how most people think. It is not a cultural earthquake or a genre revolution. But it is a story that cares about its characters, that respects its audience, and that tries to say something real about human experience through the lens of fantasy and spectacle. And in a media landscape that is often dominated by cynicism, formula, and lowest common denominator thinking, that effort matters. I watched this show expecting to be entertained. I was entertained. But I was also moved, challenged, and surprised, and those are gifts that I do not take for granted. Not every show delivers them. The ones that do deserve to be recognized and celebrated, even when they are imperfect, even when they fall short of their own ambitions, even when they are frustrating in their inconsistency. Because perfection is not the point. Connection is the point. And this show, at its best, connected with me in ways that I did not expect and that I will not forget. Okay. I have been going on for a very long time, and I think it is time to start transitioning into the final evaluation. We have covered the story, the characters, the performances, the visuals, the music, the themes, the genre context, and the cultural significance. We have talked about what works, what does not, and why. We have explored the show's strengths and weaknesses in detail, and we have tried to understand them in context. What remains is the question of judgment: is this a show worth watching? And the answer, as with most things in life, is complicated. But I want to give you a clear answer, not a cop-out. So here is what I think. This is a show worth watching if you are willing to meet it where it is. If you can accept its inconsistency, appreciate its ambition, and forgive its stumbles in exchange for its peaks, you will find a rewarding viewing experience. If you need consistency, if you need every episode to deliver at the same level, if you are easily frustrated by shows that reach beyond their grasp, you might find the experience more frustrating than rewarding. I think the ideal viewer for this show is someone who loves genre storytelling but is hungry for something more within it. Someone who watches a lot of fantasy and supernatural drama and wishes more of it had the courage to be genuinely thoughtful and emotionally honest. That viewer will find a lot to love here, and the show's weaknesses will be outweighed by its strengths. For everyone else, I would say, give it a few episodes. See how it lands. The show takes a little while to find its footing, but once it does, the journey is worth taking. And that is where I am going to leave things for now. There is more to say, there is always more to say about a show this rich and this flawed and this interesting, and we will get to the rest of it soon. But for now, I want to sit with what we have covered and let it breathe. Because this show deserves to breathe. It is not a show that can be fully appreciated in a quick reaction or a surface-level take. It is a show that rewards patience, attention, and willingness to engage with its complexity. And I hope this review has given you a sense of that complexity, even if we have only scratched the surface. I'll continue the script from exactly where we left off and move into the final portions with the verdict and outro. You know what, let me keep going, because there are a few more things I want to say before I wrap this up, and I think they matter for giving you the fullest possible picture of what this show is and what it does. I talked earlier about the show's engagement with institutional power, and I want to return to that theme one more time, because I think there is a dimension of it that I have not fully explored. And that is the way the show handles the concept of legacy. Asgard Academy is not a new institution. It has history. It has tradition. It has a lineage of students and instructors and administrators stretching back generations. And that history is not just background detail. It is an active force in the story, shaping the present in ways that the characters are constantly navigating. The things that happened before Luke arrived at the academy, the decisions made by people who are long gone, continue to reverberate through the halls and the hierarchies and the power dynamics of the present day. This is something the show handles with surprising sophistication. It understands that institutions are not just buildings and rules. They are accumulated histories, accumulated decisions, accumulated compromises. And the people who inhabit those institutions are shaped by histories they did not choose and compromises they did not make. The Academy's treatment of Luke, its fear of the Forbidden Soul mark, its rigid hierarchies, all of these things are products of decisions made long before the story begins, and the characters who enforce them are, in many cases, as much prisoners of that history as the people they oppress. Luke's disruption of the Academy is, in this light, not just a challenge to the present order. It is a challenge to the accumulated weight of history itself. And the show is honest about how difficult that challenge is. You cannot overthrow centuries of institutional inertia with a single forbidden mark. You cannot undo generations of accumulated prejudice and fear with one dramatic gesture. Change is slow, painful, and incomplete. And the show's willingness to acknowledge that, to resist the fantasy of easy revolution, gives its story a maturity that a simpler narrative would lack. There is a scene late in the series where Luke confronts one of the Academy's senior figures. And the conversation they have is one of the most nuanced depictions of generational conflict I have seen in genre fiction. The senior figure is not a villain. He is a man who has spent his life serving an institution he believes in, making compromises he considers necessary, and maintaining a system he sees as imperfect but functional. He is not cruel. He is not corrupt. He is simply invested in the status quo, because the status quo is what he knows and what he has built his life around. Luke's challenge to this man is not a righteous denunciation. It is a conversation, tense and uncomfortable and unresolved. Luke does not convince the senior figure to change his mind. The senior figure does not convince Luke to back down. They simply stand on opposite sides of a generational divide, each seeing the world through the lens of his own experience, and the show lets that divide exist without forcing a resolution. That scene stuck with me. It stuck with me because it is honest about the way change actually happens in the real world. Not through dramatic confrontations and decisive victories, but through slow, painful, often unresolved conversations between people who see the world differently. The show could have given Luke a triumphant victory in that scene. It could have had the senior figure see the error of his ways and step aside. Instead, it gave us something more real and more uncomfortable, two people who disagree, who may always disagree, who are trying to understand each other even though they may never succeed. And that, I think, is the show's most mature and most admirable quality. Its willingness to sit with discomfort. Its refusal to offer easy answers. Its understanding that the world is complicated and that the people in it are complicated and that the stories we tell about them should honor that complexity. Now, I want to address something that I think some viewers might be wondering about, which is how this show compares to other entries in the Fantasy Academy genre. Because comparison is a natural part of how we evaluate any creative work, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend that this show exists in a vacuum. If you have seen other Fantasy Academy dramas, whether from Japan, Korea, China, or elsewhere, you will recognize the DNA of this show. The basic structures, the character archetypes, the narrative rhythms, these are shared across the genre. The underdog protagonist. The rigid hierarchy. The forbidden power. The growing circle of allies. The escalating confrontations with institutional authority. You have seen these elements before, and you will see them again. What distinguishes this show is not the elements themselves but the way they are assembled and the weight they are given. Where many genre entries treat these elements as functional plot mechanics, this show treats them as opportunities for character exploration and thematic inquiry. The hierarchy is not just a backdrop for power fantasy. It is a system with history and consequences. The forbidden power is not just a cool upgrade. It is a metaphor for dangerous connection. The growing circle of allies is not just a collection of impressive abilities. It is a network of complex human relationships. That said, the show does not always succeed in elevating its genre elements beyond their functional roles. There are stretches where the hierarchy is just a backdrop, the power is just a cool upgrade, and the allies are just a collection of abilities. The show's ambition exceeds its consistency, as I have said many times now, and the comparison with genre peers only highlights that inconsistency. But I would rather watch a show that reaches high and sometimes falls short than a show that plays it safe and never reaches at all. An asterisk monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi asterisk is unambiguously a show that reaches. Whether it grasps what it reaches for is another question, one that I think each viewer will answer differently based on their own experiences and expectations. Let me talk for a moment about rewatchability, because I think this is a practical consideration that matters for anyone deciding whether to invest time in the show. Is this a show you would watch again? I think the answer is yes, with caveats. The show's best moments, the scenes of genuine emotional depth, the thematic layers, the character work, these things would reveal new dimensions on a second viewing. Knowing where the story goes would allow you to appreciate the setup in the early episodes, to notice foreshadowing and thematic echoes that you might have missed the first time around. The show is constructed with enough care that it rewards close attention, and a second viewing would provide an opportunity for that closer attention. But the show's weaker moments, the filler episodes, the genre cliches, the inconsistent pacing, these things would be just as tedious on a second viewing as they were on the first. And in some cases, they might be more tedious, because the novelty that cushioned them the first time around would be gone. A rewatch would be a more uneven experience than the first viewing, with higher highs and lower lows, because the highs would be enriched by additional context and the lows would be stripped of any novelty that made them bearable. So if you are considering a rewatch, I would suggest being selective. Skip the filler episodes. Focus on the key arcs and the standout scenes. Treat it less as a full series rewatch and more as a curated revisit of the moments that matter most. The show is rich enough to support that kind of selective engagement, and you will get more out of it than you would from a casual second pass through the entire series. Alright. I have been going back and forth between the specific and the general, the analytical and the personal, for a very long time now. And I think it is finally time to bring this all together into a coherent final assessment. Not because I have run out of things to say, because I genuinely have not. This is a show that gives you more to think about the more you engage with it, and I could keep exploring its layers and its contradictions for hours. But at some point, a review has to come to a conclusion, and that point is now. So here is my final verdict on Monster. Ako Terikat Dengan Dewi star. This is a good show. Not a great show. Not a bad show. A good show, with moments of genuine greatness and moments of frustrating mediocrity. Held together by an emotional sincerity and a thematic ambition that set it apart from most of its genre peers. It is a show that cares about its characters, respects its audience's intelligence, and uses its genre framework to explore ideas that matter. It is also a show that is inconsistent in its execution, uneven in its pacing, and sometimes unable to fully escape the gravitational pull of the very genre conventions it is trying to transcend. I would give it a solid 7 out of 10, and I want to be clear about what that number means to me. A 7 is not a dismissal. A 7 is not a polite way of saying mediocre. A 7, in my rating system, means a show that is genuinely worth watching, that has significant strengths, and that will reward your time and attention, even though it also has notable weaknesses that prevent it from reaching the highest tier. A 7 is a recommendation with caveats. Watch it, but watch it with your eyes open, aware that you are getting something imperfect but genuinely worthwhile. The things that elevate this show above average are its emotional authenticity, its thematic depth, its strong central performances, its excellent music, and its willingness to challenge its own genre. The things that hold it back from greatness are its inconsistent pacing, its uneven visual quality, its occasional reliance on tired tropes, and its inability to always balance its genre obligations with its artistic ambitions. If I had to summarize the show's quality in a single sentence, it would be this: Monster. Ako Terikat Dengan Dewi is a show that tries to be more than it needs to be, and the trying is both its greatest strength and its most persistent weakness. Now, who should watch this show? Let me break it down. If you are a fan of fantasy academy dramas and you want something with a bit more substance than the genre typically delivers, this is a strong recommendation. You will find familiar pleasures here, delivered with more craft and sincerity than usual, along with layers of depth that will surprise and reward you. If you are interested in Indonesian drama and you want to see what the industry is capable of in the genre space, this is an excellent showcase. It demonstrates both the ambitions and the growing pains of an industry that is expanding into new territory, and it does so with enough quality to earn respect. If you are a casual viewer looking for something entertaining and emotionally engaging, this show will deliver that, though you may find the slower stretches tedious and the genre conventions unfamiliar. Give it a few episodes before you make up your mind. If you are a dedicated critic or genre scholar, this is essential viewing, not because it is the best example of its genre, but because it is one of the most interesting. Its engagement with genre conventions, its thematic ambitions, and its cultural specificity make it a rich text for analysis and discussion. And if you are someone who is generally skeptical of genre fiction, who thinks fantasy and supernatural drama are inherently shallow, this show might not change your mind, but it will complicate your assumptions. It is proof that genre storytelling can be a vehicle for genuine emotional and thematic depth, even when it does not fully succeed in achieving that depth. Before I go, I want to say one more thing. And it is something that is not really about this show specifically, but about the act of watching and reviewing shows like it. We live in an era of content abundance. There is more to watch than any person could watch in a lifetime. The algorithm feeds us an endless stream of recommendations, and the pressure to consume, to binge, to move on to the next thing, is constant. In that environment, it is easy to treat shows as disposable. Watch them, react to them, move on. No show deserves more than a few hours of your attention because there is always another show waiting. I resist that mentality. I think shows deserve to be engaged with deeply, thoughtfully, and on their own terms. I think the time you spend watching a show is an investment, not just of your hours but of your emotional and intellectual energy, and that investment deserves a return. Not every show earns that depth of engagement. But the ones that do, the ones that reward your attention with insight and emotion and genuine human connection, those shows are worth celebrating, even when they are imperfect. Monster? Terikat Dengan Dewi earned my deep engagement. It is not a perfect show, and I have not pretended otherwise. But it is a show that cares, that tries, that reaches, and that sometimes, in its best moments, achieves something genuinely beautiful. And for that, I am grateful that I watched it. So there you have it. That is my take on Monster. Terikat Dengan Dewi star. A show that surprised me, challenged me, frustrated me, and ultimately moved me. A show that is flawed and ambitious and sincere and imperfect and worth your time. A show that asks whether its protagonist is a monster, and in doing so, asks all of us to think about what monstrosity means, what power means, and what it means to be bound to the people we love. If you made it all the way to the end of this review, first of all, thank you. That is a long time to spend with someone talking about a single show, and I appreciate your patience and your attention. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider subscribing to Bongo Gaming. We put a lot of time and care into these reviews, and your support means the world. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think of this show. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did it surprise you the way it surprised me? I want to hear your thoughts, because this is a show that generates conversation, and I want to be part of that conversation with you. Like the video if you found this review valuable, share it with someone who might be interested in the show, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next deep dive. We have a lot more coming, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about stories. And thank you for spending this time with me on Bongo Gaming. I will see you in the next one.